Saw dudes. With the release of new arcanes and other additions to the game, I wanted to revisit Gauss Prime, my favorite Warframe. While I work and playtest other frames, I wanted to cover all the possible builds and variations for Gauss Prime. This frame is nothing short of amazing and is just a blast to play. No matter how much I play him, I can't seem to slow down enough to pick up another frame. Similar to my Volt video, I will cover all the build variations and their strengths. Let's get started.
How it feels to chew 5 gum.
Araga! Help! Help! Help me!
Stimulate your senses.
We're going to start with an overview of Gauss's abilities. If you already know how the frame works, feel free to skip to the build section. Speedy Boy's passive is his battery, which gets filled or depleted based on his actions. Gauss builds battery by moving, casting Mach Rush, casting Cold Thermal Sunder, and hitting enemies with melee attacks while kinetic plating is active. His battery depletes when he falls off of the map, stands in nullifier fields, gets hit while kinetic plating is active, and with casts of Heat Thermal Sunder. As his battery builds, Gauss passively gains bonus shield recharge rate and shield recharge delay reduction. This maxes out at 120% for recharge rate and 80% for recharge delay reduction. Gauss's first ability is Mach Rush, where he dashes towards the closest Ellen Joe poster. Casting the ability causes Gauss to sprint and charges battery by 10%. Holding the ability key allows Gauss to continue the rush. Hitting enemies while rushing will knock them down and charge his battery by 1%. His second ability is Kinetic Plating. Casting this ability causes Gauss to shield himself with a barrier, reducing damage from impact, puncture, and slash, as well as cold, heat, and blast. While the barrier is active, he becomes immune to heat, cold, blast, stagger, and knockdown procs. 5% of incoming damage is converted into energy for Gauss, which is incredibly good in Steel Path and essentially grants infinite energy as long as you are trying to kill stuff that is trying to kill you. Each hit received while kinetic plating is active will deplete the battery. Gauss's third ability is Thermal Sunder and has two versions, Cold and Heat. Tapping the ability key releases a cold proc to all enemies in range and charges the battery by 10%. Enemies that are already affected by a cold proc will be frozen solid on subsequent casts. Holding the ability key releases a heat proc to all enemies in range and depletes the battery by 10%. When cast on enemies with an existing heat proc, this ability deals its normal damage plus the damage of the current heat proc. Casting Thermal Sunder of the opposite damage type on enemies already afflicted with cold or heat procs combines the damage type into blast. Casting cold, then heat knocks enemies away from Gauss. Casting heat, then cold will pull enemies towards Gauss. The blast proc will permanently reduce the enemy's current amount of armor based on the battery power level before inflicting its damage. Finally, we come to Redline. On cast, Gauss grants himself access to 100% of his battery, granting himself increased weapon fire rate, melee attack speed, reload speed, and casting speed based on his battery level. While the battery power level is above the Redline limit release, damaging projectiles of arcing electricity will periodically shoot out from Gauss, which can stagger enemies. While Redline is active, Mach Rush's energy cost is half. It also causes kinetic plating to grant Gauss a 100% base melee damage bonus and a 100% chance to stagger enemies on hit. Cold Thermal Sunder freezes enemies instantly, Heat Thermal Sunder has its heat procs deal full damage over time to enemies, and blast procs from the ability permanently strips away the current amount of armor based off of battery power level up to a maximum of 100% with a full battery charge. While at max battery with Redline active, kinetic plating can completely block IPS damage and heat, cold, and blast damage, effectively making Gauss invulnerable. Now we can go over the fun stuff. Gauss's Gameloop. At the start of the mission, activate kinetic plating for damage reduction and energy generation. Next, run into a group of enemies and let them hit you a couple of times to generate energy. From there, build up battery charge using Mach Rush and Cold Thermal Sunder. As soon as you hit the cap, activate Redline and keep building up battery charge until the meter caps out. At this point, recast kinetic plating and spam Heat Thermal Sunder to kill enemies. Keep in mind you can cast a Cold Thermal Sunder to expedite the heat proc damage and strip armor. Rinse and repeat. This Gauss video features 6 build variants. Each variant has just about the same foundation with a couple of mods switched around. Because Gauss Prime is so versatile, I suggest getting an Aura Forma just in case you want to experiment. Our first setup is meant for Thermal Sunder room nuking and utilizing high range. Regardless, the base of every build will start with the Aura and Exilus slots, which are taken up by Brief Respite and Cunning Drift respectively. Brief Respite allows us to leverage shield gating for survivability, and Cunning Drift increases our maneuverability and ability range. If you want to embody the concept of speed, feel free to swap Brief Respite for Sprint Boost and Cunning Drift for Rush. Primed Continuity, Augur Message, and Constitution make up the core of the build, providing us with a baseline of 207% ability duration. I know this may not seem like much, but keep in mind we are going to outsource the rest of our duration from arcanes and archon shards. To buff our range, we're going to use overextended, stretch, and augur reach, landing us at 280% ability range and a radius of 33.6 meters for thermal sunder, which is more than enough room for nuking. Because we need to stack heat procs on enemies, we need to use Archon Vitality and ideally use an unranked version. This causes every heat sunder to apply 3 heat procs instead of the usual 2, drastically increasing our damage. Prime Flow increases our energy reserves, which is mandatory given the spammy nature of this build. This build will require Molt Augmented if you plan to carry this into Endurance, since it lacks a neutral ability strength stat. The second setup is just a slight spin-off and substitutes Overextended for Rolling Guard. This setup is fully capable of nuking, but has a bit less range. With a 190% range stat, our Thermal Sunder will have a radius of 22.8 meters, which is still a good amount if you're just running around. This setup is tailored more towards endurance missions and utilizes Rolling Guard as a failsafe in case you step into a nullifier bubble or fall off the map. Because this build doesn't use Overextended, we will have more freedom in our arcane choices and don't need to worry about kinetic plating not granting us 100% damage and vulnerability from IPS, blast, cold, and heat. In my opinion, this build is the safer alternative for nuking. Alright, we've reached the point where you're only going to swap one mod to change the way that you will play. If you are dead set on nuking enemies as soon as they spawn in, try using Streamline in the last slot. This will tank our duration, bringing it down to 179%, but as I said earlier, we can outsource it from Archon shards and arcanes, so it's not a big deal at all. The extra ability efficiency given to us from Streamline allows us to spam Thermal Sunder much more, and not have to worry about completely losing energy. Because both versions of the ability crowd control enemies, spamming it might reduce incoming fire, thus reducing energy generation. Streamline mitigates this problem for the most part, so you're free to slay out. Next, and I don't entirely recommend it, you can put Narrow-Minded in the last slot. You might be tempted to do this since it brings our ability duration to 278%, but trust me, it's not worth it. For reference, without Archon shards or arcanes considered, this build brings our redline duration to 83.4 seconds, but it brings our thermal sunder radius down to 14.9 meters. This drastically reduces our nuking capabilities and it's just not worth it in the long run. I found that with this build, you will be spending more time and energy positioning yourself correctly than just killing enemies with thermal sunder. You also want to remember that there will be some diminishing returns to ability duration, so while it may be cool to have a super high amount, there are always other stats that would serve you much better. If you're looking to buff your weapon damage, you can slot in Thermal Transfer, which allows you to infuse weapons with heat, cold, or blast damage. Cast of Thermal Sunder grants you and your allies 75% bonus elemental damage to the corresponding type. I like using this mod to add extra heat damage to my Tenet Cyclone, but it can mess up any elemental synergies you have going on. If you're planning to nuke with Thermal Sunder, this might mess up your game plan. Thermal Transfer converts Gauss into a full weapons platform, and while it doesn't take away from your nuking ability, it may mess up any elemental setups you have. Try out your weapons in the Simulacrum before committing to anything in a high-level mission. And finally, we have Fast Deflection, which is kind of a meme build, but I'll cover it anyway. Keep in mind this build variant is supposed to be used with Arcane Aegis and is meant to abuse shield gating. Gauss's passive, as mentioned earlier, causes shields to recharge faster and with a shorter delay based on its battery level. This stacks with Fast Deflection, which can further reduce the delay. Combined with Arcane Aegis, you can negate nearly all health damage assuming you have kinetic plating active. I would like to remind you that you should not be actively looking to do this in a real mission. This, like Rolling Guard, acts as a failsafe and is just an extra layer of security. That being said, I don't think it's necessary at all since your enemies should be long dead before they hit you this much. Alright, Gauss doesn't need Helminth abilities, but I know some of you will still do it anyway. My recommendations for subsumed abilities are Energized Munitions, Roar, and Sentient Wrath. Energized Munitions is an obvious choice since Gauss chews through ammo like nobody else. Since Redline boosts the fire rate of weapons so much, it's easy to lose track of how much ammo you're burning through. With Energized Munitions, you don't need to worry as much about ammo economy. Roar is purely used to increase all of our outgoing damage. As you probably heard already, Roar is considered a Bane mod and double dips for status damage. This allows us to drop our Bane mods on our weapons and instead focus on other stats. For Gauss, in particular, Roar triple dips for Thermal Sunder. Each cast cubes the 30% bonus, resulting in a 2.197 damage multiplier for heat procs. The final option I'll recommend is a bit strange, but I wanted to experiment. Sentient Wrath increases enemy damage vulnerability and is a final damage multiplier. This will drastically increase the damage done by Thermal Sunder and weapons. Also, the lifted status applied by this ability gets factored in for gun CO and condition overload, so it's great to experiment with. The best arcane options for this build are Arcane Aegis, Arcane Avenger, Arcane Ice Storm, Molt Augmented, and Molt Efficiency. As mentioned earlier, Arcane Aegis is meant to be used in conjunction with Fast Deflection. This combo will abuse the shield gate timer and keep you alive under heavy fire, but it will not save you from toxin, electric, or gas procs. It's a fun arcane if you like seeing enemies continue to fire at you, like Nice Pool. Otherwise, I would choose something else. Arcane Avenger works even when guarded by kinetic plating. It's a straightforward crit chance buff that is best utilized with weapons that have a high critical multiplier, such as the Kuva Nuke. This is a great choice if you want to use weapons just as much as Thermal Sunder. Arcane Ice Storm is a no-brainer at this point. Much like Frost, Gauss can freeze enemies on a whim. This arcane grants ability strength and duration, both of which benefit Thermal Sunder and Gauss's other abilities. This arcane is especially useful if you plan to subsume an ability over Mach Rush. Molt Augmented is only really used if you're using the nuke setup with Overextended. After achieving 250 kills, this arcane grants 60% ability strength, which negates the 60% ability strength penalty from the aforementioned mod. I don't recommend using this arcane in any other setup. Finally, we have Molt Efficiency, which grants up to 36% ability duration. This is the go-to mod for many Gauss players and is a solid pick that enhances every one of his abilities. Personally, I run Arcane Ice Storm and Molt Efficiency together. This combo allows me to take off Narrow-Minded and enhances the damage done by Thermal Sunder without having to change the game loop. Of course, if you want to use weapon-specific arcanes, you are free to do so. The focus school I chose to go with for the remastered build is Madurai. Gauss already has plenty of safeguards, so Vazarin is entirely unnecessary. Power Transfer increases casting speed for our Warframe, which is nice, but is only really used to decrease the animation length of Redline. Redline decreases the casting animation for all other abilities while active, so you won't see too much use of this perk. Sling Strength, while somewhat niche on Gauss, does increase the base damage resistance of kinetic plating and damage of Thermal Sunder. This perk is much more useful when using Overextended, since the 40% ability strength buff can offset some of the negatives at the start of the mission. If you use Roar on Gauss, this buff can be put to great use. Void Strike and Void Fuel are arguably the best parts of Madurai for Gauss. Since Gauss can fire round after round like nobody else, he makes the best use of Void Strike and Void Fuel. In level cap missions, this ability alone will make priority targets quiver. Void Fuel is just the cherry on top, and gives us 40% weapon efficiency while Void Strike is active. This is exactly what Gauss needs to avoid ammo issues and is extremely nice to have. Archon Shards. Yeah, you guys know the drill on Gauss. Go for full Tauforged Crimson Shards, all attuned for ability duration. If you don't have Tauforged, don't worry. The regular version is just fine and is more than enough. Ability duration benefits all of Gauss's abilities and increases the potency of buffs provided by Redline. Since our Archon Shards are fully dedicated to ability duration, we don't need to slot in Narrow-Minded. This allows our build to have good nuke potential and good weapon platform viability. That being said, feel free to try out other shards if you want. At the very least, try to have 3 Tauforged Crimson Shards on him to keep ability uptime at a decent level. Now we only have weapon recommendations left. Gauss is ammo hungry, meaning that he likes weapons that don't suffer from ammo issues or are capable of wiping rooms with a few shots. Primary weapons that fit the bill are Excelsior Prime, Fulmin Prime, and Torrent Incarnon, just to name a few. Excelsior Prime has great AoE potential, and despite its abysmal ammo capacity, it still holds up well. Plus, it can easily bypass this fault with Vigilante supplies. Fulmin possesses a battery mechanic, meaning ammo issues are non-existent. Just wait a second and you'll have a full mag to dump. Finally, Torrid is an Incarnon weapon. As long as you consistently use the Incarnon mode, you'll never truly run red in the terms of ammo. How about secondaries? It's generally the same story. My recommendations are Acarius Prime, Nil Prime, Prisma Angstrom Incarnon, and Tenet Cycron. Acarius Prime operates in a similar vein to Excelsior Prime, offering good AoE coverage and damage with mitigated ammo issues with an ammo mutation mod. Nel Prime has infinite ammo, assuming you can land headshots, which is exceedingly simple when spamming Cold Thermal Sunder. Prisma Angstrom Incarnon gets super easy Incarnon charge and has very little issues with ammo. Finally, Tenet Cycron is a battery weapon, but also stacks up heat procs quickly, allowing it to nuke off of Cold Thermal Sunder casts. Melee weapons are kind of all over the place. My favorite is Praetos, but that's mainly because it grants sprint speed, slide distance, and parkour velocity. What can I say other than I like to go fast and knock the sonic rings out of my enemies. Alright, that is it for the build video. I hope you guys enjoyed it and found it useful. After experimenting with other frames for so long, I had to get back to my roots and run around with Gauss Prime again. I just love having a race car in Warframe. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any suggestions or thoughts, leave them in the comments. As always, thank you for watching, and happy farming.